According to recent studies, LGBTQ people have become the most persecuted individuals in the world, with many fleeing their native countries seeking asylum here in the U.S.
Eyewitness News reporter Roxie Bustamante explains how San Antonio is helping them escape persecution and start over here.
It was a packed house as dozens of people filed into Guillermo's restaurant downtown.
There's a lot of people that are being persecuted from their countries just for being LGBT.
The goal, to educate the community about the humanitarian efforts aimed to help the LGBTQ immigrants and refugees.
The Chamber of Commerce and the World Affairs Council, we team up together to bring this program on how we can empower our local young professionals to go out there and really help these refugees.
I'm really glad that people are more aware about these issues and willing to take a step, or become more involved.
Davis Solis, an immigrant from Mexico, sponsored someone who was fleeing from his country and seeking asylum here in the United States.
There's a lot of stories that he has talked about in his country, and it's just very sad. I cannot, even fathom just being myself and just being persecuted or attacked just for being who I am.
He says, unfortunately, this is a reality for many people around the world, and often they are afraid to speak out, fearing for their lives or their family's safety.
These people could be killed in their countries. Sometimes these governments don't have protections for them, so they just seek a place really where they can survive.
Roxie Bustamante, KENS 5 Eyewitness News.